SFL webinar series. My name is Leah Ashford, and I'm the director of the SFL webinar series and an executive board member of SFL. We are honored to have Professor Coyne deliver to help them advance their ideas and applications of classical liberalism. The resources we offer include free books for student groups, a speakers network, protest grants, and books on running a student organization, tabling kits, leadership training, an academic journal for liberty and society, and our bread and butter conferences. The SFL webinar series is our way of giving you access to the ideas and mentorship and liberty year-round from wherever you are. We hold webinars each week to put you in touch with the top mentors and scholars for liberty in the country. Tonight's webinar is with Christopher Coyne. Chris Coyne is the F.A. Harper Professor of Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He is also the North American editor of the Review of Austrian Economics. In 2008, he was the Hayek Fellow at the London School of Economics, and in 2010, he was a visiting scholar at the Social Philosophy and Policy Center at Bowling Green State University. Professor Coyne is the author of After War, The Political Economy of Exporting Democracy, as well as Media Development and Institutional Change, and the editor of a handbook on the political economy of war. So it sounds like I'm getting an echo. Sorry about that, guys. I think we should be all good when Professor Chris Coyne starts to speak, and then we'll work on the sound issue for that. But just to note, there will be about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of the webinar, and feel free to type in any questions into the question box. I guess we'll let Professor Coyne jump in, so go ahead, Chris.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you, Leah, for arranging this, and thank Students for Liberty for having me, and thank you all for joining in. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is my new book manuscript. This is actually the first time I've presented it. As Leah mentioned, it's called The Ability to Protect the Limits of State-Led Humanitarian Action, and it's a follow-up to my previous book, After War, The Political Economy of Exporting Democracy. And basically in that earlier book, what I did was use the tools of economics and political economy to analyze the ability of foreign occupiers to export liberal democratic institutions to other countries. So basically what we were trying to do, or I guess to some extent what we are trying to do still in Iraq and Afghanistan, but there's many other examples throughout the history of the U.S. One of the questions I'd frequently get when I talked about that book was, what about humanitarian action? So in that book, I came away being skeptical of the ability of the U.S. and other Western nations to export democracy at gunpoint. And people would say, even if they agreed or disagreed with my analysis, they'd always say, well, what about humanitarian action? What if the U.S. or other Western governments limit their activities to purely humanitarian type things? And so I realized that was kind of a gap in that previous book. It was just beyond the scope of what I was trying to do, so I figured I'd write a follow-up book and try to explore this question. And as I started thinking about it, I realized it was a much bigger issue because humanitarian action has become so broad that it basically incorporates everything, even exporting democracy. So it was much bigger than I first thought. In any case, I'll explain, or you'll see briefly in a few slides where my title, The Ability to Protect, comes from. I'll make that clear. But what I want to do tonight is just touch on some of the key themes in my book. So let me first give you some background. And I should start by just explaining what I mean by humanitarian action. And as it applies, as the name implies, and as most of you would probably figure, basically what I'm referring to is actions that are undertaken to remove human suffering. So there's lots of different kinds of human suffering. There's post-disaster, so those are things like natural disasters. There's genocide, there's post-conflict suffering, there's extreme poverty, so many places in Africa, for instance. And there could be other examples as well. I should note, by the way, that what I'm going to talk about tonight applies both domestically and internationally. So I'm going to focus mainly on international humanitarian action. So in other words, the United States government going into Libya, that's a good example. But everything I'm going to talk about applies domestically as well. So for instance, you could think about the U.S. government intervening domestically in the wake of Katrina, for instance. That would be an example of humanitarian action as well, statewide humanitarian. This is an economist. And basically what I realized when I started looking at this stuff was that most politicians and practitioners who are involved in humanitarian action talk about, or focus on, I should say, the moral aspects of the problem. So you can look back to John F. Kennedy, who was key in founding the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, in the 60s. And as you can see from this quote, he points out that there's a moral obligation for developed countries to help poor countries. There's many examples of this, and I could have put up many quotes, but another example of this is the R2P doctrine, the responsibility to protect, if you've heard that term. Basically, this is a normative doctrine, as the name implies. The argument is basically that the international community has a responsibility, a duty to protect people in other countries when their governments are unable to do so. And so you can see, hopefully, how my title of my book comes about. It's called The Ability to Protect. So instead of focusing on the normative aspects, on what we ought to do, I'm using the tools of economics and political economy to focus on the positive aspects. So instead of making the argument that the U.S. government or governments of developed countries in general have a moral obligation or a responsibility to help others, what I want to talk about is what is their actual ability to help others. In other words, what constraints do they face and what can they actually accomplish in practice. As an economist, we try to remain as positive as possible, not positive in our outlook, but more specifically positive in the way we approach our subject. So we try to focus on what is as compared to the normative aspect, what ought to be. And of course, while I can't make moral arguments as an economist proper, economic arguments can inform those moral obligations. So for instance, you might say, well, we have an obligation, a moral obligation to help other people. And I can use the tools of economics to understand exactly what you can and can't do. And then that will help inform whether that moral obligation is actually something you should try to fulfill. This is important because let's say you somehow arrive at a position where you say, okay, we have an obligation to help poor people, a moral obligation. If I demonstrate to you that your efforts to help people, which might be driven by the best of intentions, let's say they actually end up harming the very people you want to help, then you'll step back and be like, okay, that moral obligation is not a very good one because I'm actually harming the people that I intended to help. And that's the power of economics. So while economics can't tell us what we should do, that's a ethical or moral question, it can help us inform those questions. So the responsibility to protect doctrine, it emerged, I think, around 2000, but it was officially adopted by the United Nations in 2005. And you know, this kind of language, the responsibility to protect language was used, if not exactly in that language, and rhetorically it was used by President Obama and by other world leaders with Libya. People have brought it up now with Syria. And again, the argument is that if governments are unwilling to protect their own people, or if they're harming their own people, like what's going on in Syria right now, the international community has a duty, a moral obligation to intervene to prevent it. Again, it's a moral argument. Some other examples. Tony Blair, 2007, points out the moral power of political action to make the world better. Barack Obama points out that wealthier nations have a moral obligation. And basically what you see with politicians is this rhetoric around moral obligations and really a neglect of basic constraints. Let me give you an example of a quote that illustrates the lack of basic constraints. So this is from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who was talking to the Council of Foreign Relations. And she said the following, this is a quote: "Americans have always risen to the challenges we have faced. That is who we are. It's in our DNA. We do believe there are no limits to what's possible or what we can achieve. For the United States, global leadership is both a responsibility and an unparalleled opportunity." That's the end of the quote. So you might say, okay, this is just fluffy rhetoric that all politician types use. Well, maybe. But if you actually look at how politicians act, and policymakers, and even humanitarian practitioners, both in government but also in NGOs and in civilian type roles, oftentimes they act as if there's no limits, there's no constraints on what they can accomplish. In other words, what they focus on is, oh, we just need more resources and more effort and more planning. And if we have the right resources and the right people, we can achieve any outcome we want. What economics focuses on is that there's real limits on what we can accomplish. And if you try to go beyond those limits, you can actually cause more harm than good. And I'll talk more about that momentarily. So my purpose is basically to focus on the ability of outsiders to help people in need. All right, so there may or may not be a moral imperative, a moral obligation to do so. From my standpoint as an economist, it's irrelevant. what I want to focus on is what actually can you accomplish in practice. So in some sense, I lose some of the glamour, right? It's nice when people can say you have a moral duty to do this, you must do this, we have to intervene here. People like when there's some kind of rule of thumb of when you should intervene and when you can't or shouldn't intervene. I'm going to offer no such thing. I don't claim to have any magical formula of when the U.S. government should intervene to help people or shouldn't. I'm not going to provide a how-to guide of how to rebuild countries or fix them or cause economic development. In stark contrast, what I'm going to do is point out the limits, what we actually can accomplish. So you might, you know, given your skepticism of government, which I imagine many of you have, given that you're listening to me right now, a lot of this may not seem surprising to you. But do keep in mind that for a majority of people, they view government as a solution to many of the problems in the world, humanitarian problems being just one of them. So what I'm going to point out, I don't view as being pessimistic. I view it as basically being a realist from the standpoint of pointing out what can actually be accomplished in practice. Again, keeping in mind that neglecting these constraints and neglecting the incentives at work can cause real harm to ordinary people. It can actually increase suffering, which of course the goal of humanitarian action is to remove. Now, as my title indicates, I'm going to focus on what I call state-led humanitarian action. By state-led, I basically mean the government plays a dominant role. Typically, they play a lead role in organizing the humanitarian action, they fund it, and they oversee it. Now, in addition to focusing internationally, I'm going to put aside, we can talk about this during the Q&A if you want, issues of purely private humanitarian action, things like, for instance, private charities, churches, and so on. But what I want to point out for now is that since World War II, if not slightly before, maybe since World War I, you could make the argument, the state, in other words, governments, both single states, so like the United States, and the what's called the international community, that's things like the World Bank, the IMF, and so on, basically collections of governments, have become the dominant player in international humanitarian action. In other words, it's very hard to find humanitarian action that does not involve government in some form. Even NGOs, non-governmental organizations, have become increasingly reliant on government funds. And if you look at basically the receipts, the flows of money to NGOs, early on, so at the turn of the century, early 1900s, basically those organizations had to raise donations privately. As time progressed, they started to receive more and more funds from government. And in the post-World War II period, there was a renewed emphasis on in the government space on kind of aid effectiveness, something that continues to this day. And one of the things that governments tried to do is rely more and more on NGOs. The logic being that, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard, if not thought about, is that kind of private organizations are more flexible. They're more effective in delivering aid. So the government said, okay, if they're so great, let's funnel funds through them, right? We're the state, we have lots of money, we can scale things up, but instead of spending it ourselves through government kind of agencies and bureaucracies, which they still do, by the way, I'll talk about that a little bit, we can funnel it through these NGOs. Of course, that causes some issues, which I'll discuss in a little bit, mainly that NGOs are no longer, again, NGO stands for non-governmental, really they've become an arm of the government. They become governmental organizations in a weird way because they're subject to a lot of the rules and restraints put in place by the government. So let me start by pointing out this. A good place to start if we want to understand the limits is let's talk about what the outer limits of humanitarian action are. What's the best that humanitarian action can do? And in order to start thinking about this, I want to talk about this issue of adaptability. Now, some of you may have seen the recent book by the economic journalist Tim Harford. He writes for the Financial Times, among other outlets. And his newest book is called Adapt. I think the subtitle is something like How Success Starts with Failure, or something close to that. And he points out that what success requires is adaptability. And adaptability is basically the ability of people or organizations to learn from their mistakes. Not just to learn from their mistakes, but also to correct those mistakes relatively quickly. And of course, he points out that, look, we're human. We make errors all the time. That's not surprising or novel. The important point is, can we address those errors when they exist? And he points out that adaptability basically requires two things. The first is feedback. In other words, you have to know that you have made a mistake. And the second is an incentive to act on that feedback. So first of all, you have to know that you've made an error and that you adjust behavior, and the second thing is you have to have an incentive to do it, or you won't act on the feedback. So I want you to keep this in the back of your mind, this notion of adaptability, as we go through the subsequent slides, because really when it comes to humanitarian action, what we're going to care about is adaptability. Why is this the case? Well, humanitarian resources are scarce. Really what you want to accomplish, what the governments want to accomplish when they're spending money, if their goal is to help people, I'm taking that as given, by the way. I'm assuming that they actually want to help people and remove human suffering. So you might say, no, there's some grand conspiracy to do something else. Well, I'm taking that end as given, that they actually want to help people who are suffering. But mistakes are made all the time with scarce humanitarian resources. They're misallocated. They get allocated in ways that don't maximize their return, meaning that they don't help as many people as they could. Errors get made. Unintended consequences happen, as I'll discuss. And adaptability would require those errors to be realized and then acted upon. So we want to understand if there's feedback and if there's an incentive to act on that feedback. So to understand the outer limits of state-led humanitarian action, I basically want to step back for a moment and think about this idea of what I call the planner's problem. And let's go back to basically markets versus central planning. This is very important to understand this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about socialism. Don't get me wrong, I'm not calling humanitarians or government socialists. I'm not trying to be value-loaded here or to make any kind of argument about that. I'm just trying to point out a very simple point, which you can't dispute because it's by definition true. Resources are scarce, meaning you can't have everything you want, and they need to be allocated somehow. Okay, that's the core problem in economics, is that how to coordinate people given that there's the scarcity constraint. The problem, of course, is figuring out how to allocate those scarce resources in a manner that maximizes their value. By that I mean that produces things people want, that makes them better off. And there's basically two ways to allocate scarce resources. One is through markets, and one's through central planning. And this is important because the adaptability under each system is very different. The idea or the argument of why markets are more effective at allocating resources than central planning goes back to something called the socialist calculation debate, which you may have heard of. Basically, this occurred in the early 1900s up through, let's see, 1930s, 1940s. And on the side of capitalism, of markets, was Ludwig von Mises and F.A. Hayek. And then on the other side, on the side of central planning was, well, I won't name them all, but there was an array of people who are arguing for the effectiveness of socialism as a means of allocating scarce resources. I should make very clear, because people get confused, this was not an ideological debate. So it wasn't like Mises and Hayek were saying, I like markets because of natural rights, or I like them because I like them. It was a purely technical economic argument. It was an argument over what means of organizing economic activity was the most effective means for improving the human condition, in other words, producing wealth. The socialists argued that nationalizing the means of production, in other words, abolishing private property and centralizing production, would generate a higher level of output than capitalism and overcome all the ills of capitalism. So you'd have just as much, if not more, output, wealth that is, and you'd overcome things like business cycles, unemployment, inequality, and so on. Mises and Hayek were viewed as losing the battle at the time. They ultimately won, of course, because central planning failed. But I don't want to go through all that for right now. What I want to highlight is this point that Mises made, and then Hayek talked about it as well, and it's called economic calculation. And basically, economic calculation is the ability to engage in the rational calculation of alternative uses for resources. So just think about it. The world's full of scarce resources, and there's lots of different things we can do with those resources. For instance, there's steel. We can do lots of different things with steel. We can build a bridge. We can build a building. We can let it lay idle. We can think of many other uses for that steel. The fundamental question from an economic standpoint is, how do we best allocate steel, or you can insert any other scarce resource into my example, in a manner that maximizes their value to society, to consumers, to you and I. What Mises and Hayek pointed out was that this process of economic calculation, this analysis of competing uses of scarce resources, can only occur through markets. More specifically, they only can occur under private property, which allows for markets and exchange. And markets and exchange allow for prices, right, with the use of a monetary unit. And the reason prices are so important is because they communicate information. More specifically, that communicate relative scarcities. If one good is $2 and another good's $1, you know the opportunity cost of buying the good that's $2. It's 2 of the other good that's $1. And so you can calculate opportunity costs. You also can calculate, as Mises pointed out, expected rates of return. In other words, you can estimate, right? You can look at prices and calculate the costs of inputs. You can estimate, or you're basically forecasting what price you'll get for the finished product, and you can see if a project makes sense or not. Of course, if you think you can sell it for less than it costs to produce, you're going to make a loss. Now, of course, as I mentioned, people make errors all the time. Well, again, prices play a key role in that process because they were real errors. How do they do that? You produce something, you think it's going to make a profit. It ends up it doesn't. No one wants it. How do you know that? You know it because you suffer a loss. In other words, you realize that the costs of the inputs are greater than what you can sell it for. That sends information to you that those resources have been misallocated, those scarce resources, and that you should stop doing it. Now notice the reason we like markets as economists is because they are highly adaptable, to use the language I just introduced to you. They provide feedback through economic calculation, and they provide an incentive to act on that feedback. The incentive being profit, which provides an incentive for risk-taking, and losses, which provide an incentive for prudence. Right? So there's a natural balance in markets. Central planning is highly unadaptable. That is, you don't have the feedback because you lack prices, you lack profit and loss, and you have a weak incentive to adjust precisely because there's no profit and loss like there is in markets to reallocate resources. So the planner's problem is that absent market prices, absent profit and loss, you have no way of allocating resources to their highest valued use, which is ultimately, by the way, what's required for development. Think about what economic development is. Oftentimes, people get confused. They think of things in terms of output measures. Right? Even GDP, it's a good proxy in some sense, but it's the wrong way to view things because it's just total output. It doesn't tell you whether it's good or bad output. What we really care about is producing things that you and I as consumers value, and that's what naturally happens through the markets. That's why we say you can't plan economic progress, because absent economic calculation, you don't know what to produce or how much to produce. The problem is, or to the extent there is a problem, humanitarian resources are centrally planned. Again, this is not to knock that. That's just how it's done. There's reasons why it's done. A lot of humanitarians view markets as kind of the opposite of charity. They'll say markets are based on greed. Now, many of us would disagree with that somehow that's bad, but nonetheless, that's a standard view. And they say, look, we can't rely on markets, so we have to rely on charity. Another thing to think about is that in many of the poorest places in the world, people just don't have the income to purchase goods. So, in poorest parts of Africa, they don't have money to purchase food like you and I do. So we give it to them as charity. So to say that humanitarian assistance or humanitarian action is centrally planned is not to knock it as being bad. It's just to point out that means there's a limit on it. They can't engage in economic calculation. The same exact way that planners in the Soviet Union couldn't engage in economic calculation. So you'll see what this does. If you followed me so far, and I've realized I've covered a lot already with the calculation argument, but absent economic calculation, humanitarians can't solve the economic problem. All right? In other words, they don't know how to allocate resources to their highest valued use. What this implies is that humanitarians can't cause economic development. Economic development requires a constant reallocation of resources to higher value uses. Entrepreneurs come up with new ways of doing things. A lot of them fail. That's revealed through the market. People adapt accordingly. And others are successful. Again, that's revealed through the market as well, through profit. And it's that continual reallocation of resources, which is what the process of economic development is all about. So this is the outer limits of what humanitarian aid can do. It can basically increase outputs. It can't cause development, right? Because we don't know what to produce. We suffer from the planner's problem. But that doesn't mean we can't help people. Imagine this. You're hungry. I give you $5 and I say, go buy groceries, right? We do this all the time. That makes you better off. You've increased the output of food available to yourself, right? I've given you charity and you've purchased food. Or I go buy you a loaf of bread. I've increased the amount of bread in your house now. And that's basically what aid can accomplish. It can increase outputs that are predetermined by planners. But don't get confused. Increasing output is fundamentally different than increasing wealth. To understand this, I could become a czar of bookshelves. Same office right now. I could say, look, I want to put a lot of people to work and increase output. I'm going to tax people at 90% and allocate all those taxes to producing bookshelves. And we'll have lots and lots of bookshelves. People will be put to work and we'll increase output, we'll increase GDP. Most of you would say that's patently absurd. And the reason it's absurd is because we don't need that many bookcases, right? We don't want to allocate all our scarce resources to bookcases. We like lots of different things. In that instance, I've increased output, but I haven't increased wealth. They're fundamentally different things. So now here's the problem. Even within those outer limits, right? So people stay within them. In other words, humanitarians try to increase outputs. That, by the way, that is a purely technological problem. It involves things like picking up stuff that's already produced and bringing it to those in need. But if you look, there's lots of examples where even these efforts mess up. So this is one example I found from Afghanistan. There's tons of these examples. Medical equipment. Okay, so we give medical equipment to hospitals in Afghanistan that we're building as part of the reconstruction effort. In principle, this makes sense. We're helping people that need health care, right? We're giving them high-tech healthcare devices. Well, there's tons of examples of this just being wasted, and here's one, right, where the report indicates that the resources are just sitting there unused, they're in boxes, no one knows how to use them, there's no maintenance, right? Just basically wasted. Good scarce resources are sitting there and they're not helping anyone, even though they were intended to do so. Another example from Africa. Okay, this is from another government report. Up to 70% of equipment lies idle due to mismanagement of the technology, lack of user training, and so on. Again, scarce humanitarian resources, they could have been used to help people if they had been delivered in the right way to the right people. This is within the limits of what humanitarian action can actually accomplish. It's not trying to solve the economic problem. You don't need economic calculation. Notice what this means, by the way. This would be the equivalent of me saying to you, okay, you bought one loaf of bread last week. I'd like you to buy 2 loaves this week, and I'm going to pay for the second one. Here's $2. And then you go to the store, and you come back, and you have no loaves of bread. And I'd say, wait, what happened? Right? I gave you money. It's a purely technological issue. You walk into the supermarket buying loaves of bread, right? This should be very simple. And you say, yeah, along the way, the money got lost, right? Or it got wasted somehow. I got to the supermarket, and the money got wasted. That's basically what's happening. Or I got there and there was no bread there. I couldn't purchase it. Those are the type of things that are actually happening in many of these instances. So now we have to understand why that happens. So we know now that humanitarians can't solve the economic problem. They can't cause development. Notice what this means for a lot of the development debates about the end of poverty and more foreign aid would somehow end poverty and cause development. Planners can't cause development. This is Mises and Hayek's point from the early 1900s, just a variant of that same argument. So now let's talk a little bit about why we see this failure in the delivery of basic humanitarian goods. And you can find lots of reports. You can look up stuff like delivery of food, for instance, and water. And a lot of it never gets to the very people it's supposed to be delivered to. Again, this is a purely technological issue. We have food here. We have water. It's the equivalent of picking up a tray of water, bottled water, and bring it, for instance, for Haiti after an earthquake and just handing out to people in need. And somehow it doesn't get there. That's what we need to understand now. To understand that, we need to shift now to politics. So state-led humanitarian action is basically politics. It's driven by governments at all different levels and both domestically and internationally. So let's spend a few minutes talking about politics. And here's basically what happens. A lot of people make the mistake, they make the false dichotomy, and they say, okay, in markets you have competition because people are competing for money, but in politics you don't have that because of benevolence, right? This is kind of the public spirited argument that politicians care about people, or they're public servants, market participants only care about themselves. It's a standard dichotomy. Now, economists, especially those working in the tradition of political economy or public choice, point out that this isn't the case. Basically what happens is the same people that are acting in political institutions are the same people that are in market institutions. In other words, people don't transform from a greedy, selfish individual into a public-spirited angel if they're elected to office. People respond to incentives created under each set of institutions. What does this mean? Well, if you want to follow what I'm saying, basically what happens in the humanitarian realm is that market competition is replaced by political competition. In other words, politicians and policymakers centrally plan the allocation of humanitarian resources, and there's intense competition for those resources. Now, it's true they're not sold for a profit, so we don't use markets, as I already mentioned, but that doesn't mean there's not competition. Here's just a few of the parties involved that are heavily involved in influencing, competing for scarce humanitarian resources. Recipient governments. Okay, these are the governments in the country receiving the resources. They compete constantly to get as much aid from developed countries as they can. Within donor governments, if you look at the array of agencies and bureaus involved in the delivery of humanitarian aid just within the United States, there's many of them. They're competing for scarce resources, right? So the legislature divvies up the budget, and then everyone's trying to get their hands in the pot as much as they can to secure as much as they can so that they have the resources to control. NGOs, as I mentioned, non-governmental organizations, they start to compete for government contracts because if I don't get it, you're going to get it. So what happens? Well, NGOs start allocating a lot of their effort and a lot of their own resources to basically building political relationships such that they can secure more resources than other NGOs. And in doing so, as I already mentioned earlier on, they lose their independence. And finally, special interests. Special interests are basically collections of voters who attempt to influence policy. So what's one example, and there's many, of how this affects humanitarian aid? Well, some of you may have heard of something called tied aid. Okay, and here's what tied aid is very quickly. Tied aid is that the United States government, can be any government, but let's stick with the United States, gives aid to another country. But they tie it to certain conditions, hence the name tied aid. One example of this is food aid. So the U.S. government will give food aid to countries, but they say, well, you can have the food aid, but you must purchase it from U.S. manufacturers of food, and it must be shipped over to you on U.S. ships, right? They tie it to certain conditions, in this case, the U.S. producers and the U.S. shippers. Why do they do this? Well, at least rhetorically, they do it so that they can monitor and control the aid. But if you actually look at what's going on, the food producers, the shipping industry, they lobby the U.S. government to do this so that they get business. Another example with tied aid is condoms in Africa. Condoms in Africa are actually produced in one of the most conservative towns in Alabama. And the reason they are produced there, which by the way they're produced at a cost of 4 times what they could be produced elsewhere. In other words, you could have 4 times as many condoms, which are one of the most effective means of spreading, preventing the spread of STDs. You could have 4 times as many if they were produced abroad, if we outsourced it, but we produce them in the United States because it creates jobs, and senators lobby for this in order to basically bring jobs to their district. And again, you can see how scarce humanitarian resources are wasted. So what's the main takeaway here? The first one is that humanitarian action is always political. Now, you're going to say, of course it is. That's not new or novel to me. Well, if you read stuff on humanitarian action, this point is continually overlooked. Humanitarians fancy themselves as somehow being independent. They kind of view themselves as being kind of neutral and above politics and above being manipulated. But the minute you include politics and things like I've discussed, it basically becomes political at all levels. And the second thing is that those most in need of aid don't receive it. We should have no confidence or very little confidence that the political process actually allocates resources to those countries that need them. By the way, if you don't believe me, think about what's going on in Syria right now, and it plays out perfectly. What's the problem in Syria? Well, people say we should intervene, right, to stop the violence, or the United Nations should. Well, what's happening? Russia and China, which are 2 members of the UN Security Council, are blocking it. Why? Well, guess what? They have important political ties with the Syrian government, and they don't want to ruin those ties. So even though people, innocent civilians, are dying, and let's assume that we could be effective in the intervention. I don't know if we could or not, but let's assume we could just for the sake of argument. It's still not happening. Those in need of help aren't receiving it because of political factors. So this is just a simple application of the idea that politics doesn't transcend basic incentives. Now let's talk about bureaucracy. Again, something most of you know a lot about, so I'm probably saying what you already know, but it's still good to highlight it. Excuse me, I just wanted to get a drink. Basically, bureaus are all forms of non-market organization, but in politics, basically governments are bureaucracies, right? They don't price their outputs, and they're basically a large nonprofit. That's what government is. Now here's the thing, we can use the tools of economics to understand and make some predictions about how bureaucracies operate and their general claims, and then how they manifest themselves in particular contexts will vary, of course. But here's the thing, absent profits, right, so a business judges itself on its profit loss on its ledger, basically, whether it's profitable or it's not profitable. Bureaus can't do that. So what do? They measure their success based on the size of their budget, the number of subordinates. That's basically what indicates their power, their effectiveness, how much money they have to spend and how big they are. This creates three perverse incentives, or three tendencies. The first is that government agencies, since you and I as consumers don't purchase a service, right? When we go to Dunkin' Donuts, we reveal that we value Dunkin' Donuts. So we go and purchase it and we reveal our demand for it. Well, there's no mechanism to reveal our demand for a government bureau. You don't walk into the Department of Education and purchase, a cup of coffee like you do at Dunkin' Donuts. So there's no way as a consumer for you to reveal your demand. So what they do is create their own demand, because where they get their money from is not from consumers. They get it from legislators who divvy up the budget process, who are involved in the budget process and allocate scarce resources. So they create demand. You all observe this. Think about any government bureau, and what will you observe? We did okay or we failed, and the reason we failed is because we didn't have enough resources. If only we had had enough more money and more people, things would have been different. Typically what bureaus do is create demand in terms of creating fears. In other words, they create problems. We have an education crisis, an environmental crisis, a terrorist crisis, and you can go on down the list. There's lots of crises all around, and we need more money to fix it. Because if we don't have the money, then we can't fix it, and the world will end. Second, mission creep. Mission creep is just the tendency of bureaus to expand their portfolio or array of activities. And why do they do this? Well, if they're driven by the desire to secure more money, one very effective way of doing this is to increase the array of activities that you undertake. And if you increase the array of activities, then you can say, look, I need more money. Finally, bureaus neglect cost savings. Okay, businesses basically get to keep money that they save. Let's say you're a business owner and you figure out a way to save money during the quarter or during the year. You get to keep that money as the owner. You have a continual incentive to minimize waste. This doesn't mean that waste doesn't exist in private business. All it means there's a tendency to remove it. You have an incentive as a business owner to be adaptable. Resources are misallocated, and if you reallocate them more effectively, you'll benefit. Bureaucrats lack that incentive. Why? Well, think about what happens to a bureaucrat or a bureau if they don't spend down their budget. So let's say you're allocated $2 million and you only spend $1 million of it. And you go back to the legislator at the end and you say, look, I was really effective. I saved the taxpayers $1 million and I was very effective. I did a good job. What are you going to do to reward me? And of course the legislator said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut your budget next year because obviously you can do the same amount of work that we thought you could on less money. So I'm going to use that money elsewhere. Bureaucrats realize this and spend down their budgets completely. They have an incentive to spend down all their money and ask for more. In other words, it's the exact opposite of what we observe in for-profit settings. So what happens? Well, basically, humanitarian resources are allocated through a very complex chain of layers of politics. This is what economists call a principal-agent problem. And a principal-agent problem goes something like this. A principal is an individual that hires someone, their agent, to do something for them. So imagine you're an employer. You have a business. You're the principal. Your employee is your agent. Now the problem from an economic standpoint is one of asymmetric information, or in plain English, monitoring. You have to make sure that your employees aren't shirking, right? You want them to work for you, to do things. They know that if you're not monitoring them somehow, they can shirk. They can not do their job, right, because you're not monitoring them. So the problem is that with asymmetric information, it's very hard to make sure that the people you've hired are doing what you want them to do. Now let's just think about a dollar. Okay, let's think about a dollar that goes from your pocket as a taxpayer to someone in Haiti, let's say, following the earthquake. Just think about it. You hire, I put that, I should be in quotes because you didn't hire them like you would hire any other contractor. You hired them through a political process of elected. But let's just go with the language. You hire an elected official who supposedly looks out for your best interest as a taxpayer. They tax you. Supposedly you pay it voluntarily. We'll go with that again because I don't want to get into that right now. But you hand your money over, and what happens then? Well, elected officials hire, again in quotes, government bureaus, right? They allocate that dollar to some government bureau to do something. Then government bureaus either spend the money directly or they hire people. So they hire employees or they hire NGOs, again in quotes. NGOs then either spend the money or they hire subcontractors. In other words, what I'm getting at is you have no way of knowing where your taxpayer dollars go, especially when they go abroad. It's impossible for you to track even if you wanted to. And what this means is there's no way for you to monitor the complex array of agents in the political process. What's the result? Exactly what we'd expect, lots of waste. Here are two examples, and you can find many others. I should just point out, if you look at the source of the quotes, SIGAR, so that's the Special Inspector General for the Iraq Reconstruction, and then SIGAR is Special Inspector General for the Afghanistan Reconstruction. Basically, it's a fancy title for kind of the auditor of the Iraq Reconstruction, that's the top one, and the Afghanistan Reconstruction, that's the bottom one. So weaknesses in DoD, that's the Department of Defense, financial management controls left it unable to properly account for $8.7 billion of the 9.1, so over 90%, of the money that was allocated to development for Iraq. Now I want you to think about any business that couldn't account, literally could not account for 90% of its money. It would be out of business. In Afghanistan, close to $18 billion in funds earmarked for Afghanistan's reconstruction was unaccounted for in the labyrinth of contract bureaucracy. In other words, they couldn't track $18 billion of taxpayer money. It's literally just floating out there somewhere. We know it's out there, we just don't know where it is, how it's being spent, and so on. This is just two of numerous examples of this type of logic. And it's very simple why it happens, because people don't have an incentive to take care of it. So you get constant waste, you get weak adaptability with bureaus because they don't have an incentive to take care of resources, and you constantly get a tendency to push beyond the outer limits of what humanitarian action can achieve. Why? Well, go back to what I talked about with mission creep. So if you're a bureau, how do you get more money? You expand your array of activities. What does that mean? Well, ideally, you'd focus on humanitarian logistics. That's the delivering the water from us to Haiti. That's the purely technological issue, which, again, we're not very good at. What happens with mission creep? They say, oh, well, we just can't deliver the water. We have to make sure that people can produce their own water, and we have to help them get developed so that they don't become dependent on us, right? So now we have to get involved in development, and they continue to expand their portfolio of activities such that it becomes so broad that they move beyond the outer limits I discussed earlier. Now we go to system effects. This is the other reason why there's so much failure. System effects is just another word for basically unintended consequences. But talking about it in terms of systems, I think, is a better way to think about it, because here's what happens. People tend, it's our natural tendency it's the way our brains work, to kind of compartmentalize things and simplify things. In other words, we think about things in linear terms, right? More inputs equal more outputs. That's how we think about things. But systems thinking, specifically complex systems, indicates that that's the wrong way to think about it. So with systems, you basically have a set of elements that are interconnected, and a change in one part of the system will have ripple effects throughout the rest of the system, and the entire system exhibits properties and behaviors that are different from each of their parts. This, by the way, is just another way of saying a concept you're all familiar with, which is Hayek's notion of spontaneous order, purposeful human action but not human design. Basically what he's saying is that, what Hayek's saying is that the broader order is a complex system that no one person can understand, let alone design. System effects basically refer to unintended consequences. And here's what happens. Policymakers, politicians, they intervene in complex systems. They think they understand what's going on. They're supposed experts. I put that in quotes. And they say, okay, if we just get these resources, this amount of aid, we undertake these better political institutions or economic institutions and so on. That's linear thinking. It's like building a bridge, right? What soil? They figure out what type of bridge that will be most effective in terms of supporting the expected traffic. They can figure out what resources are needed, and they can build a bridge. That's a technological issue, right? And that's fundamentally different than planning a society. You know, one of the things people always say to me, and politicians always say this, you'll remember after the BP oil spill, President Obama got on TV and he said, you know, we sent a man to the moon so we can do X, right? That's completely irrelevant. You know, people have said this to me, we sent a man to the moon, we can fix Afghanistan. Well, I've looked a lot at the materials on Afghanistan. None of them say the goal is to launch a spaceship from Afghanistan or send someone to the moon. That's a technological issue. It's not the same as rebuilding an entire country. Those are two fundamentally different things. So basically what happens is when politicians think of things in aggregate terms, what I mean by that is think about just, okay, we're going to spend more aid, right, and we're going to get more growth. That's linear thinking. It's that more inputs equal more outputs. What this neglects is that people behave strategically, right? If you inject aid into a system, you're going to shift people's incentives, and you're going to change their behavior in the future as well. All right, so again, all I'm really getting at here is the basic economic point that people respond to incentives. If you dump a ton of resources into a country, you're going to have people react strategically and change their behaviors both in the present and in the future. So what are some examples of negative system effects? Corruption, dysfunctional political institutions, right? If you pay governments for being corrupt, now of course we don't think about it as paying them, right? It's not like they're getting rewarded. Well, they really are. How do countries get foreign aid? Well, you have poor people. How do you have poor people? Well, you have relatively bad political institutions which keep people poor. So if governments get foreign aid for being dysfunctional, they have an incentive to be dysfunctional. What else? What we call the dependency effect, or the Samaritan's dilemma. Here's the dilemma that you face if you're a good Samaritan. You give a homeless person money on the street. It's true it might help them buy food, but you've also basically increased the wage of being homeless, right? You've basically provided an incentive for people to become dependent on handouts because you have increased the profitability of acting that way. Increased crime, stolen aid, stolen assistance, black markets, peacekeeping personnel. This is one of the things that are often neglected. Now, an interesting thing, I want to pick up the pace a little bit because I'm running out of time and I want to hear what you have to say. Peacekeepers are not subject to domestic laws. They're immune to domestic laws. And crimes by peacekeepers are actually quite high, both sex crimes, things like rape, abuse, but also criminal theft. These are very common, and basically what happens is the people in these countries that the peacekeepers are supposed to help are helpless, basically, right? They have no recourse. They have no access to police or courts to seek recourse. I think there's a movie called The Whistleblower that talks about this in the context of Bosnia, which, of course, one instance of sex crimes committed by peacekeeping personnel created a big scandal. So what's the implication here? We need to replace linear thinking with systems thinking. Systems thinking means you cannot understand the world, right? It's not that you're completely helpless, like we're wandering around bumping into random things. We can understand basic things, but we can't understand the complex array of systems that makes up the world, which means we're just limited in what we can accomplish, right? Understanding the limitations of what we can do is good. That helps us not make mistakes. And the other thing is humanitarian action will always be more difficult than initially appears. Think about Iraq, right? Remember the original discussions. We'll be in and out in a couple weeks, right? Libya, we'll be in and out in a couple weeks. They get rid of Gaddafi and they're like, see, we did it. Well, what's happening now? Now you have armed militant factions who are committing abuses against civilians. So what are we going to do now? We can let it go, but again, you have civilians who are suffering, or you can intervene again, which wasn't part of the initial plan. And again, it's more complex than it initially appeared, precisely because we can't understand the complex world. So to finish up, rethinking state-led humanitarian action. This is a great quote from Hayek, and basically this quote first appeared in Constitution of Liberty, which was published in 1960, and it also appeared in Hayek's Nobel Prize lecture called The Pretense of Knowledge. And as you can see, what Hayek's pointing out is that if we don't want to actually harm the world, in other words, if we don't want to do more harm than good, we have to realize that complexity is all around us, and we can't possibly acquire the full knowledge that's necessary to understand it, right? He says we can't master the events as we wish. So what Hayek points out is we have to understand the limits of our knowledge and also think about creating broad institutions that allow people to be free and engage in experimentation and to make mistakes, by the way, right? Because making mistakes is part of being human. We always engage in errors. We're not perfect. Again, this is why that issue of adaptability is so important, because we want to be able to correct where errors exist. So that's kind of broadly how we want to think about it. So to the extent that you have state-led humanitarian action, or private humanitarian action, by the way, what you'd want to focus on is increasing short-term outputs. That's the best that humanitarian action can do. You can deliver water. You can deliver food. You can hand someone a tent. You can do those things. There's oftentimes lots of waste involved. That's the examples I gave you. There's unintended consequences involved. Those are some of the examples I just gave you. But this is the best possible case. You cannot, when I say you, I mean governments, NGOs, churches, whatever. You cannot create development. It's impossible, right? It's the planner's problem. It's the same reason that Mises pointed out that socialism was impossible, meaning it couldn't solve the economic problem because of the absence of economic calculation. We need to think of development as discovery and basically focus on creating an environment of economic freedom. Now, creating an environment of economic freedom, which is really grounded in private property, is also hard. We don't have a good idea of how to plan private property institutions, and there's a lot of stuff we could talk about with that, what to do. Another way to think about this, our natural tendency is to focus on intervening abroad. Let's go over there and fix things. Well, another thing we can focus on is focusing on domestic barriers. In other words, if you really care about human suffering, let's think about ways that we can domestically take steps to help people around the world. So what are some examples of that? Well, we know that trade and immigration, right, allowing people to migrate, makes people better off. This is just the basic logic of gains from exchange and comparative advantage. So one of the things we can do domestically is remove barriers to trade and immigration or migration, right? There's an economist by the name of Michael Clemens at the Center for Global Development who's done a lot of important work on this issue of immigration and migration. And he points out that if we removed barriers and allowed people to move, it would make the poorest people in the world, their lives better off. So I'll stop there. Leah, I think you're going to ask me questions, and then I can try to answer it. And I can stay, we have like 8 minutes, but I can stay a couple minutes after if we need to.
Thank you so much, Chris, and to all of our participants. We'll do Q&A now. I don't think I'm getting any feedback now, so sorry about that from the beginning of the webinar. So please type in any questions into the question box, and I'll go ahead and read them to Chris. So we have a first question already. The question says, it's one thing to talk about the most efficient use of resources within an industrialized society, but if a population is literally starving to death or is being oppressed by a brutal dictator, isn't it worth a great deal of inefficiency to do something to improve that condition?
Okay, so a question about efficiency of resources, and I want to argue that you still should want to argue for efficiency. Why is that? Let's say lots of people are starving. Actually, efficiency is even more important in this instance. You have 5 loaves of bread to hand out. Would you rather get all those loaves of bread to as many people as possible, or would you rather have one of them handed out and waste 4 of them, right? Well, I'm going to guess you're going to say precisely because these people are starving, you want to get all of that bread handed out. That's an efficiency issue. It's ensuring that resources are allocated their highest valued use. That doesn't mean that you can't hand out the 1 loaf of bread, but here's the other reason you should care about it. What if I told you that I gave one person a loaf of bread, but in the process 4 people were killed because other people were fighting over the 4 loaves? Then you've run into an issue of, well, now you're starting to think about trade-offs, right? I have unintended consequences where I put this scarce resources, bread in my silly example, right? And people start fighting over it. I meant to help them, I meant to feed them, but really what I've done is cause conflict between them, right? So here's the problem. People observe these extreme circumstances, right? Like people starving, brutal dictators, and it pulls at the heartstrings, and it should. It's brutal. It's not, believe me, it's not like I'm saying we should embrace it and cheer. But here's what I am saying. There's a pull to do something, do anything, right? And say, look, we have to do something because this is so bad. And all I'm saying is let's step back and think through some of the consequences, because what people have to realize is that the intention to do good is not the same as doing good. And in many cases, you can actually cause more harm than good. And granted, it's very hard to forecast exactly what's going to happen. But a lot of times, basic mistakes are made that could have been avoided if just a little more thought went into it. So I think one of the things we have to be very careful about is assuming because things look so bad that they can't get any worse. They can. All right? We can actually cause more suffering to people who are already suffering a great amount. And that's what we have to realize.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Our next question, can you discuss in more detail how state-operated foreign aid shuts out or fails to engage the recipients of the aid, the recipients being the regular citizens?
Okay, so how does state-provided foreign aid shut out citizens? It's pretty simple, which is you have someone in Washington, D.C. allocate allocate money to, let's say, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. Then USAID has field missions or it allocates money to other NGOs, and then they decide how money is allocated out to the recipients. Now, who are the customers in this instance, right? Look, we understand how markets operate, and what do we like about markets? There's producers and there's consumers. And we talk about consumer sovereignty, the idea that consumers drive the process. That's what we like about markets. That's when we talk about markets satiating the wants of consumers, what we mean. Let's think about it in the context of foreign aid. The final recipients are technically the customers. They're the people we're trying to help, right? The people that's starving, for instance. Okay, if they need food, we don't want to hand them a book, right? We want feedback from them, just like markets yield feedback. What's the problem? With foreign aid through states, there's no feedback from the customer, none at all. The customer becomes the various bureaucrats in the process who lobby for aid and then decide how to allocate it. This does not mean, by the way, that all aid is wasted or can never help anyone. The broader point is the very basic issues of adaptability, feedback, and the incentive to adjust are not there. They're just not there in the context of state-led humanitarian action and foreign aid. And you can look at there's tons of studies on the ineffectiveness of state-led foreign aid. This is not novel to me. It's not because I'm a libertarian, I don't like government. Even the staunchest proponents of more foreign aid point out that it's failed, right? Jeff Sachs at Columbia University, he's the runs the Earth Institute, right? He's lobbying right now to become president of the World Bank. What does he argue? In his book, The End of Poverty, he says, look, foreign aid hasn't worked, but we need just smarter foreign aid. So he even admits it hasn't worked. Then the debate shifts, can we make it better or not? And then that's a whole debate in itself. But the reason it hasn't worked is because of perverse incentives and the lack of knowledge, right? Planners don't know how to allocate resources to maximize their value, and they don't have an incentive to fix things when they go wrong. And that's fundamentally what happens. There's a fundamental disconnect between recipients and you and I as taxpayers.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Our next question, what do you think about spending money to aid refugees escaping dictatorships or states in crisis?
Unmuted. Well, there's a lot of different policies like this that you could ask me about. You could ask me how I feel about spending money on food for people that are starving, for instance. Again, if it's spent well, in theory, it can be effective. My argument is we cannot make the argument that aid can never work because we have instances where it can, right? We've had people buy stuff and it's gotten there, so it's not zero, but there's a tendency for it not to work. And so giving refugees money that are escaping a dictator is fundamentally no different than any other kind of aid. So I don't want to make a blanket claim that we should never do it, but as an economist, what I can point out is absent the appropriate incentives and knowledge, it's not going to be effective. So what I'd want to know, or what I'd push back, I guess, if someone asked me about this, is I'd say, look, how are you going to decide who gets it, who gets how much? How are you going to monitor that the aid is used the way you want it to be used? What incentives do you have to change your behavior if it's not being used? And what do you think the unintended consequences are? What negative unintended consequences are going to arise? You know, for instance, with refugees, there's many examples of setting up refugee camps and the actual members of the army that are committing the genocide, since they don't, in these countries, they're wearing civilian clothes, a lot of them. They don't wear full military garb, so it's not easily identifiable. They end up in the camps. In other words, they end up consuming humanitarian resources, and they kind of recoup and then go back out and kill people. There's an excellent book by, what's her name? Fiona Terry, or I think her name is. I might be getting that wrong. Yes, Fiona Terry. It's called Condemned to Repeat, and it gives case studies on how humanitarians have actually, in many cases, ended up harming the very people they want to help, like these cases of genocide, where they actually end up supplying aid to the very people committing the crimes. And she makes a very similar point to what I said, which is the pull, the desire to do something and to do it quickly, leads people to basically put aside thinking through things, just throw resources after things in the spirit of it can't get any worse, we have to do something. And she says, look, in many cases you end up funding the very people that are causing the heinous crimes in the first place. So I'd be skeptical until I heard more.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Our next question, what is your analysis on the microloans, and are these a step towards overcoming the problems planners usually face?
Unmuted. So I take this to be a question about microfinance, I believe is what we're getting at when we say microloans. So microfinance, for those who aren't familiar, are basically small-scale loans to people in poor countries. And the idea was that, originally, okay, there's very poorly developed, if there's any markets at all, for capital, so capital markets. In other words, loanable funds markets, right? So you and I, if we want to start a business, we can go to a bank. Doesn't mean we're guaranteed to get it, but that's part of the capital markets. We can raise capital. In very poor countries that don't exist, those don't exist, or they're very dysfunctional, and the idea was, well, if we can replace that with small-scale loans, we can have people who have entrepreneurial ideas borrow money to invest. And here's basically what happened. In principle, this is fine. In other words, if you as a private investor want to go lend people money, that's fine, right? That's no different than doing it here. But what happened very quickly with microfinance internationally is the governments got involved. They started making claims like that private lenders were gouging people with the interest rates, and they started capping the interest rates. Governments started injecting their own money in, and the idea of scaling it up. Right? The argument for government involvement in development is a scale issue. They say, look, private investors, a church, for instance, has limited funds, but governments, they can invest, millions upon millions upon millions of dollars. So they can scale things up in a way that private individuals can't. And basically, my understanding of what I've read lately, which I think is the consensus in development economics, not just my view, is that microfinance is basically on net had no effect on actual development. It's actually turned into a problem in many instances because it's become heavily regulated and distorted by government. But in principle, to the extent this type of thing exists, purely private settings, it's no different than any other market. So to that extent, it's good. That's what we would talk about in terms of how markets work. There's people that want to invest money and people that want to borrow it, and it's coordinating those two individuals together.
Thank you, Chris. Our next question: if the state or de facto state-run NGOs can't allocate the actual resources necessary for humanitarian aid, can they do something to improve the institutions of third world nations so that less humanitarian need is necessary?
Unmuted.
So this is a question about actually reforming the fundamental institutions. So by this, I imagine you mean things like the political institutions, legal institutions, so things like police, courts, economic institutions to reduce barriers to business. I mean, look, it's this has been tried for a very long time, all the way back to after the collapse of communism, right? We tried to reform economies, but even back to then, I mean, development economics started back, by the way, development economics came out of socialism. You should understand that too, following in the World War II period. It was basically the idea that central governments in developed countries could plan development in other countries. It came out of the same principles that socialism as a form of economic organization did. Nowadays we call socialists like it's supposed to be like a name we call people, but it's just a body of thought about how to organize economic activity. That's the foundations of modern development economics. And the simple answer, which is not going to give you a specific answer, is that we don't know. We don't know. We don't know how to build a free society from scratch. And this is really Hayek's point, right? What Hayek calls the extended order of a free society. It's a spontaneous order. And he even points out we don't know how to design it from scratch. We don't know how to fix things. We can make suggestions. So for instance, I could look at a country and say, look, you don't have a lot of private investment. It's because you have a lot of regulations, right? There's something called the Doing Business Index that the World Bank puts out. It basically measures things like number of days to get the necessary permits, how much it costs. If it costs you 2 years of income to get the necessary permits to open like a fruit stand, there's going to be lots of underground economic activity. In that case, as an economist, I can make a recommendation. I can say you should think about removing barriers to entry. That will lower the cost of business. But I have no special knowledge in terms of designing a constitution, for instance, or in terms of designing legal institutions. And other people don't either. And that's been the problem. And that's fundamentally, I think, what went wrong in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, look, we were very effective in destroying governments. We're very good at destroying things. We're the most advanced country in the world at blowing things up, which is what our military is meant for, right? The military's comparative advantage is force. And we can topple governments very quickly. What we're not very good at is rebuilding countries from scratch. In other words, exporting liberal democratic institutions. I mean, heck, most of you realize we're not very good at keeping them at home. So I don't understand why people are so confident we can somehow get them abroad.
Okay, thank you, Chris. And looks like we're a bit out of time. Let's end with one more question. And our last question is, so we shouldn't go get that Connie guy? Question mark.
We have sent troops over there, small armed forces, but we definitely shouldn't watch a documentary on YouTube and base any foreign policy off that. There's one of the things people like to talk about is, well, if you all believe in freedom and liberty, right? They wouldn't be here. So what can we talk about when we see people suffering? Well, think about this. What would a truly private humanitarian system look like? We have part of it in place already. I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, give to charity in some form. You've helped people before, even if it's just friends or family members. That's private humanitarian action. You could envision something else internationally where people funded almost mercenaries to go abroad and get people like that. Now there's problems with that too. It's not perfect, but you can think about alternatives like that. But the reality is these are complex issues, and here's something I want you to keep in mind, which I've realized a lot of conservatives and libertarians forget about. You are skeptical, I take it, of the government's ability to run the post office, of their ability to run the education system, of their ability to run healthcare, to regulate if you eat Doritos or not, and so on. I could keep going. Those are all domestic issues in a first world country. I don't understand why people who are skeptical of those type of things all of a sudden grant magical powers to the government when we say, okay, they can't run the post office very well, but if we give the post office guns and send them to another country, which is really what government bureaucracy is, that's why the post office doesn't work well, somehow they can create development, rebuild entire countries, and make things better off for people. It's just the same things that make you skeptical domestically. Keep that same mindset internationally, and I think it will go a long way. And remember, it's much more complex internationally. So things that we aren't very good at home, when I say we, I mean the government, it's going to be even worse when we go abroad. And if you think about it in those terms, that's the way to frame it. Now, I'll leave you on a note of optimism, which is the best thing we can do for well-being around the world is increase economic freedom. You all know that what the process of wealth creation is driven by entrepreneurs and innovation. So the best thing you can do is continue to agitate for increased economic freedom, even domestically. That will help people globally. This is just globalization on markets, right? So that is the single best way to improve the human condition over the long term. So that's what I would recommend that you continue to think about and agitate for. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it. And again, thank you, Leah and Students for Liberty, for having me.
Thank you so much, Chris, and to all of our participants this evening. We apologize if we couldn't get to your question, but please feel free to continue the discussions with other participants in the chat room or on the Facebook event. And I hope you can all continue coming back to our webinars to learn more throughout the year. Our next webinar is next Wednesday, March 28th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time with Jeffrey Friedman on the myth of the greedy bankers, what really caused the financial crisis and what that says about capitalism. To register for the webinar, please visit studentsforliberty.org. On a final note, shortly you will receive a follow-up email where you will find more detailed information about SFL on our next webinar. You'll also receive a survey to evaluate the webinar. Please take a couple minutes to fill it out. It helps us know how to improve our programs and makes these webinars more interesting for you. And with that, I think we are officially wrapped up. We apologize again for the sound issues in the beginning, but thank you again for your time this evening, and have a wonderful night, everyone.